Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where Andrew, Ben, and myself explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler. I just mentioned Andrew and Ben. How you guys doing today, fellas?
Good.
Great.
Never better.
Always one-upping me.
All right, let's just jump into some questions we got today. We might get through a few of them, so here we go. Number one, today is an interesting day. Mask mandates are now for everyone again, and the Pfizer vaccine got its FDA approval. This must be somebody who lives locally here, talking about the mask mandates. There's so much controversy. I've been rereading that article from the Gospel Coalition, The 4 Approaches to Race, Politics, and Gender, which you have mentioned before. You've also talked about masks and vaccines being a matter of conscience. I agree, but hashing out what is a matter of conscience and what isn't can be confusing, especially when mandates are coming at us from the government. With government leaders like Rand Paul calling for people to not comply with the mandates and the Bible telling us to obey our government leaders, it can be a very confusing time. We want to be submissive to the government, but what do we do when the government is asking us to go against our conscience? When is the proper time for civil disobedience? What is the proper way to go about civil disobedience? I know the Bible is not silent on the subject. They go on to mention that they would like to hear like a panel represent the 4 approaches in this, which would be interesting. Maybe we can talk through some of that stuff.
Someday.
But yeah, we could even maybe play some of those roles today. But overall thoughts on this. I think the big question here is you have some people in government saying don't comply with the mandates that are coming down. You have the government itself saying, here are the mandates. Maybe the mandates go against your conscience. What should you do?
On the civil disobedience issue and on do I listen to this senator? Or do I listen to that senator? Do I listen to this governor? Or do I listen to that governor? Do I listen to this, agency that's, or this specific leader here or that specific leader there? And the nature of our politics. I think that as an American, and this will be my short answer on how to handle the civil disobedience issue. I think that you, as an American, your guiding mandate is the Constitution. The government works for you in America. So I think that that's a way to approach these issues when you're wondering about what do I do with said government mandate in this moment, or what do I do with this government official saying this and this government official saying this, or whatever, and then the whole direction of it changing every 2 days, right? What do I do? Follow the Constitution, and as you do that as an American citizen, I think that's the way our government is set up. So that's been an angle that a lot have talked about through this last couple of years. Is how do you when seemingly at times random or contradictory mandates or suggestions or these kind of things, or when you have one level of the government, the federal government, let's say like under Trump, saying one thing here, and then you have another official within the federal government saying something else, and then you have your own state, depending on where you live in, either going the Trump direction or the government official direction, and it's all contradictory and it's all over the place. Follow the Constitution. That's what you should do. And so, and that's just as an American. And I think as a Christian, when it comes time to practice civil disobedience is when, what was the thing? We talked about this like a year and a half ago, but there's a great article on this. I don't even remember, but it's that idea like from Daniel, when the government is leading you to do something that violates. It's either when they're telling you to do something that's not biblical,
that God forbids, or commanding,
or forbidding you from doing something God commands.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when they're commanding you to do something God forbids, or they're forbidding you to do something God commands, those are like the hard, fast, Book of Daniel, Acts 4, biblical examples of, in Acts, the church is going, they're telling us not to preach in the name of Jesus, but Jesus is commanding this, so we're going to do that. In Daniel, he's saying, don't pray. And then he prays. But also in Daniel, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, their Hebrew names. You have them, you just preached on that at camp, where in there they're saying, do this, and God's forbidding that. So, those are the times when you practice civil disobedience. But I think the entire issue, as foggy and as crazy as it can be, I think a really good approach to it in our current day, in America specifically, our type of government, is follow the Constitution. And So.
Well, and I think if you in your conscience feel like, what is being mandated is unconstitutional, then I think you could, disobey if you felt that way. Now, my personal kind of feeling in some or a lot of circumstances is just to kind of go with the flow on it. Like, I have realized this time around, though, it doesn't seem like certain stores and restaurants are enforcing it like they did the first time around. Like, I've noticed a lot more people not wearing it in grocery stores and stuff, and it doesn't seem like anyone's doing anything about it. So, I don't know. I think it's really complex, and you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. At least that's how I'm kind of rolling with it.
I think if we have a Instagram post with like a quote from this episode, it should be that. Hey, I think you should just go with the flow.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's my personal approach.
That's your personal conscience, is go with the flow?
Well, it's circumstance by circumstance. So me on a Sunday morning at our church versus me in the grocery store, like, I have different opinions. Like a grocery store, restaurant, I just don't care. I throw it on until I get to my table, take it off. I don't feel like this conviction to like stand up for my freedoms, and people that do, like, whatever. At church though, I mean.
So like when the government is like, you should not sing at church.
Well, like, that would be commanding or forbidding something God commands.
Yep.
Same with, I mean, that was the sticky wicket, as you would say, in regards to gathering, because Hebrews 10, we're commanded to gather.
Yep.
And so how long do we let that go on? That's messy and complex. But there's also conscience issues where, like in Washington, it says if you're actively leading a religious gathering, you don't have to wear a mask. I mean, on Sundays, I'm actively leading. I'm the pastor there. Yeah. So it doesn't just say only when you're speaking or anything like that. It says leading. So those sorts of things, if your conscience said, no, well, I think it's just, only when I'm preaching. But if it doesn't, again, we need to Romans 14 the heck out of all of this.
Exactly. And tell us about that, Ben.
We need to not cast judgment on one another on matters of conscience, and not turn these things into die for issues or even divide for issues that wreck our unity. Like Ephesians 4, make every effort to live in unity in the Spirit and the bond of peace. Like, I don't know. These are important issues. We need to think biblically, critically, but we need to be humble and patient and acknowledge the complexity and not just go to one extreme or the other. And people who view things differently, there should be a lot of grace in the church instead of just falling into like the outrage culture, like the culture around us is doing.
Sure.
Yeah,
and I think another thing within this question that they asked was how do you work this stuff out? How do you work out what's a matter of conscience in a moment, on a case-by-case basis versus what's not? And I think asking these questions within community is the way to do it, right? So seeking counsel within your local church family, from your elders, from your pastors, from your leaders, and having these kind of dialogues, right, is a way to determine what should I do here in this situation? Because it's and not just this specific situation that the question asker is talking about, but any of these kinds of matters of conscience issues. That's the way I think we got to work this stuff out.
Most people that have come to me for counsel, I will say, like, if you have a check in your spirit, if this bothers your conscience one way or the other, like, you need to follow that, and that's biblical, right? If you don't follow your conscience to that person, it is sin. Paul says so. That doesn't mean everyone's going to have the exact same conscience. I mean, that's why Paul writes that, because it's different on certain things. So, but yeah, wrestling with it in community, being humble, and acknowledging the complexity of it all, I think is important.
Here's a question that maybe we don't have an answer for, but like, is there a spectrum where it's like, looking back to the question, we want to be submissive to government, but but what do we do when the government is asking us to go against our conscience, right? So is there a point where it's like, okay, like, because I mean, I could utilize, like the language of like a check in my spirit or whatever, just to not do something that I don't want to do,
Sure.
And so like, where is that line where it's like, okay, now it's at a point where I actually need to disobey, because I don't think that spot should be come to flippantly or quickly necessarily, where it's just like, I don't want to do that. my spirit, you know?
Yeah.
And like I totally agree with what you're saying, but where's the line where it's like, okay, that's actually where I should enact that now as it relates to disobeying the government.
Yeah.
And I know you know this, but I'm not saying use that as like a cop out.
Totally.
Like you know,
You were saying that. Why did you say that?
shut your mouth. That's what I just said. So where's that line? Andrew knows. Go ahead and tell
Dude,
him.
I think this whole situation of the last year and a half is a really good example of this, because we go back to March 2020, and none of us knew, and I mean none of us knew, throughout, let's just take it in America, in the church in America, none of us knew, okay, what specifically is this COVID-19 thing? What's going to go on? Everything we're hearing from experts, everything we're hearing from these institutions is saying this, and this, okay? And so like we need to, you know, and I mean, from the beginning, it was the Trump administration on a federal level that said 15 days to slow the spread, right? And then so that was kind of an agreed upon whole of government approach, and everything kind of shuts down for a couple of weeks. And then you see from there, in different states, depending on the governance of those states, what happened where, right? But I see articles online, and I see people tweeting online and stuff about like MacArthur, even, you know, like, because he was a pretty famously defied the local authorities there in the LA area, and in fact they've had recently gotten a massive settlement from both the state of California, maybe it was state of California and the local, or the local and the federal, anyway. But they shut their church down for a little bit. Like, I've heard, like, they never shut down. They did. They shut down. They shut down for like 2 months. Everybody shut down for 2 months, except for the rando dude in Louisiana. Was it, Ty, that we were reading about back on year and a half ago? So they actually didn't meet for I don't know if it was a couple months or how many weeks that was, but everybody shut down for like a month or two, at least a couple of months. It was like March into April and, you know, early May usually. And so, and sure, there's untold numbers of small little communities that might not have, you know, but generally speaking, everybody shut it down for a couple months because we didn't know what was going on. But then as it became clearer what COVID was and how the different political sides were responding, and for a lot of us, as you began to see the George Floyd protests break out in late May, the end of May, early June 2020, that's when this whole thing shifted, right? Because the same government officials who were saying, like, you're going to murder everybody's grandma if you breathe outside your home, were saying, in the name of justice, you need to be in the streets screaming at the top of your lungs without masks on. So that was on a national institutional level. The same Harvard epidemiologists, the same thing, and it began to be this thing where, like, what is going on here? So the veil started to lift a little bit as you began to go, oh, government agencies and everything's political. Like, and I'm not saying all of COVID was political, but I'm saying the way the political sides were handling this, the way the partisan sides were bickering back and forth about it, the way people were doing. And so as those things became clearer for a lot of us in the church, it began to be like, oh, this is forbidding now something God's commanding, and this is not quite what we were led to believe it was, in terms of the scale of, like, everybody is going to die in a moment here, you know? And so then it began to, like then your conscience gets informed on something. You begin to go, okay, maybe I need to handle this a little differently, or how do we do it? And so I just saw on a national level the church overall begin to shift a little bit in that. And again, there's still churches today that aren't even meeting, right? But 18 months, 19 months later or whatever. But all that to say is, as you're watching these things go on and you begin to go, oh, this maybe isn't quite what it was advertised to be, or this is contradictory here, then you begin to pray through it, talk through it in community, and begin to go, oh, we're going to meet, you know, and we're going to, everybody observe your personal conscience, right? Whether you meet or not, all that kind of things, and make you know, concessions for that, certainly within the church. But I think, like, those are the points where nobody knew. And to anybody to say right now in March and April of 2020, like, oh, I certainly knew, and I was standing, you're like, no, you weren't. You were not even meeting. Like, so I just think that's an important thing to realize. But even, like I said, even today, I don't know. There comes a point where, and we talked about it back at the time on this podcast about civil disobedience. We had an episode or two at least on that. It's probably titled Civil Disobedience, but where we went through these articles and talked through them. But you have to observe, and then it informs your conscience. You work it out in community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to do like I don't know if it'd be a study on fear or what it would be on, but I've like done some personal introspection on like how I felt in March and April of 2020 versus how I feel today.
Yeah.
And just the reality that like with more knowledge comes more peace most of the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, I wonder how many times in my life I've like completely acted out of fear when if I would have taken a breath and waited a few weeks or whatever, if I would have made better choices or, not acted in fear. I'm not saying that back in March or April of 2020, we all should have been taking more deep breaths around each other by any means. But yeah, I think that's interesting. Anything else you guys want to cover here? I
think Ben wanted to talk about pronouns.
Let's save that for another day.
Oh.
We only have a few minutes left in this episode, so we have a question for maybe for next week. But
I can speak to something, and I would love your guys' opinion. So, with everything that we've said, and it seems like we're fairly like-minded on these things, like there's within the church, like COVID is still happening. We know lots of people that are getting it. I know of my brother's a pastor in Salem. We were on a trip the last few days. He got a call early Tuesday morning that a guy in his 40s who has a 12-year-old and 2 9-year-old twins died of COVID.
Wow.
And he said what's frustrating him, not necessarily about this situation, it's so new, but other situations where people are sick, is that rather than the church kind of being the church showing compassion and sympathy, saying, oh, yeah, well, he was really unhealthy, or,
sure,
well, yeah, if he would have got the vaccine, or, those, and he's like, can we just, like, be gracious and compassionate and not politicize or criticize everything? And I've just been thinking about that, like, I think it's a good word for us in the church of, like, regardless of how you feel about all this, like, let's be compassionate. Let's love and support each other through this, and not make it like, yeah, well, if you would have done this or that or believed this or that, like, I don't know. I think that's falling into the spirit of the age and our
100%.
culture.
Yep.
It's like we should be different in the church. Like, we don't tell each other, even if we suffer for our own mistakes, we don't tell each other, I told you so as Christians. Like, we love and are restorative. Even church discipline is meant to be restorative. And like, so I don't know. I've been chewing on that, and I think it's a good word for us.
yeah, I think that some of that can be just simple immaturity, where it's like, or just sinfulness. But I also think that there's a piece of us I think I noticed this for the first time in myself whenever my best friend's grandpa died. And this has nothing to do with COVID. I was in high school. And so I went to the funeral, and the whole time I kept thinking about the fact that my grandpa was going to die someday. And it made me really sad.
Yeah.
And so with that, in that scenario, like I went home and I told my parents, I was like, hey, I think I'm like the worst person ever, because I just kept thinking about me and not Andy's grandpa, in Andy's situation. And my dad encouraged me. He's like, no, like that's actually what you're doing is like you're like being empathetic by stepping into that, by like trying to picture yourself in that same scenario. And then, but like fast forward it to COVID. And I think that like almost on the flip side of it, there's this like, you hear about a 40, whatever, like, you said it wasn't like people weren't being disrespectful or anything about this in a specific scenario that your brother went through. But like, even in my own heart, like I hear, man, a guy who's not too much older than me, who has kids about my kid's age, dies. I almost feel the need to like find a way that he's different than me to where I'm not scared.
Yeah.
To where it's like,
great, yeah.
To where it's like, okay, was he like really unhealthy? Did he have diabetes? Did he have this thing? Was he not vaccinated? Was he vaccinated? Like all these things that like, if I can differentiate him from me, then it's not as scary.
Yeah.
And so like and that's not an excuse for people to politicize this, but I think it's one of the ways that it's being politicized. Is it's like, oh man, if I can distance myself from that person's scenario, I can feel a little bit better about my chances, if you will, or the way that I'm approaching it. And so, like, I would encourage people, because I when I find myself doing that too, it's like, okay, stop, take a deep breath, and like be a compassionate person. Don't just like try to write off because they are different than you in this way or that way.
Dude, I love what you said there, Ben, about the spirit of the age, and combining that with what you said, Ty, as well. Like, think of the currency of the spirit of the age, things like fear, things like self-righteousness, self-justification, all those, because what you're describing even happening in the church at times with people, that's exactly what you see on Twitter. That's exactly what you see on the different political partisan sides, where it's someone takes a victory lap when, the guy with a different letter at the end of their name in terms of Republican or Democrat, when their political opponent goes through something, they take a victory lap, or they go, hey, see, I told you, see, this is why my policies are better. This is why I should have more power. And we do see that obviously bleeding into the church in significant ways in a time like this where, and so that's us just channeling the spirit of the age rather than actually living in step with the Spirit of God. And so, and Ty, I think that idea of fear and the way, if you don't have the Lord and if you don't have the Spirit of God within you, how are you going to battle fear? How are you going to battle the fear of death? You're going to get self-righteous and self-justifying because you know that you're not righteous and you know you need to be justified. And so you're going to be performative with your virtue. You're going to do anything you can to make yourself feel like you got to step up on the other guy, because I'm not as bad as him. And in that, I find my righteousness, right? In my comparison to another sinner. And we know there's none righteous, not even one. But that God, being rich in mercy, has made a way for us through Christ. And so he is our righteousness. And so I just think it's a gospel reality for us as Christians to be aware of that in the spirit of the age, and then also to speak into that prophetically with the word of God, to say, not so among us as Christians, but then also to offer the grace of the gospel to those who are, what a time right now what an opportunity for the gospel. Everybody's thinking about death, and we talked about that a lot in 2020, but that's still the case today. People are freaked out of death. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us as believers. We get it. We even, Ty, like you're saying, we even have those fears. And to be afraid doesn't mean you're not a Christian, right? But we even have those fears that we battle, let alone, we know our future. We know our future in eternity. We know where our righteousness is. The three of us around this table as pastors in the local church, we really know that, right? And yet it's something we're in every single day and something we're encouraging people with, but we have all those same fears, and so imagine someone who doesn't have the Lord. And I think that's where it should get us on our knees, and then it should also get us speaking the truth in love and being gracious, and then exemplifying that for as examples for our community around us. So anyway.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to send in any questions or thoughts you have to podcast@toBeTheChurch.com. You can do that on social media as well. If you're listening on the audio platform, we'd encourage you, check it out on YouTube. Check out the show on YouTube, and you can look at us while we talk instead of just listening to us talk. But until next week, have a great one, and we'll see you next Friday.